Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We will be starting in just about 10-15 seconds here. So welcome. Welcome in. Okay, we are going to get started here, Rennie. So everyone, welcome to today's Tariff Tea. This is where we break down what is happening in trade and what it actually means for you. I'm Jen C. John, COO at CargoTrans and a licensed customs broker. I'll be hosting today's session alongside Rennie Alston, our Director of Trade Compliance, who is also a licensed customs broker. Between the two of us, we're going to bring the compliance perspective and the operational lens to discuss what is changing and what it actually means for your business. Quick disclaimer before we get started, this is for informational purposes only. So as always, we recommend consult your advisors for decisions specific to your business. For our agenda today, we are going to cover three key areas. We have our hot headline, we have what is brewing this month, and then we will close with some practical actions that you can take. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the session. If we have time, we will address them at the end. Otherwise, as always, we will follow up afterward. So, Rennie, I think we should get started with hot headlines, and let's get started with, some may say, one of the hottest, which is IEEPA refunds. So this continues to be one of the biggest questions that we are getting from clients right now, and likely will be until refunds actually start hitting accounts. And the question is simple: when am I getting my money and how? So we saw late last week there was a development from the Court of International Trade, which expanded the refund scope to now include additional entries. So whether they are unliquidated, liquidated, in final status. And so this also means entries outside the 180-day protest window will now be eligible, which addresses a lot of major concerns that we've been hearing from importers. So this means companies should be reviewing all entries affected by IEEPA when evaluating refund opportunities. So, Rennie, can you walk us through this? First, where
Yes.
do we stand with the CAPE platform? What do we know about that? And also, can you explain this phased rollout that Customs has introduced to us? What can importers expect?
Sure. So you hit it right on the head there, Jency. The process regarding the refunds begins first with the go live date of this consolidated portal, which will be vetting your import entry history from February 2025 through February 24th, 2026. And the anticipated rollout is the week of April 20th. So we're still waiting on a go live date. However, the announcement from late last week was that the portal on the Friday was able to process 66% of the entries in scope to be received. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be able to perform a vetting of the remaining 34%. It just meant it was 66% ready. So I anticipate, like with every ACE rollout, there's going to be, again, some glitches in testing and go live date. But what's different here in a normal ACE rollout is they are being monitored by the Court of International Trade. So I expect an announcement again. Reported this week, and then the following week, leading up to the week of the 20th, that will introduce a status. But I believe the go live date will probably be, in my opinion, moved back probably to the first week of May.
Okay, thank you, Rennie. Appreciate that. That does give us clarity in terms of timeline, so
Mhm.
appreciate it. Let's shift now to another major development. Rennie, you and I were just talking about this before we got started, and that is Section 232 and the overhaul. We're seeing a major escalation in Section 232, both in how tariffs are being applied and where they are expanding. So on the metal side, tariffs are increasing and applying to full product value, which can significantly change cost structures. On the pharma side, this is also a big shift. Tariffs are being used not just as a trade tool, but to influence manufacturing and pricing behavior. So, Rennie, this introduces a new level of uncertainty, right? And both sourcing decisions, long term planning. So, curious to understand from your perspective, what is the biggest risk or shift importers should be paying attention to here?
So obviously, depending on the industry that you're in, I'll start with the metals 232 because it is the most recent as far as the implementation date. So effective yesterday on April 6th, we had a change targeting the derivatives steel, aluminum, and copper list. And the legacy platform prior to yesterday was that if you imported a product into the United States that had a metal component, you had to pay 232 on 50% of the metal component value. Well, that now changed. If you are importing that same commodity as a derivative, that commodity now is now taxed at a tariff 232 rate of 25%, but on the full value of the product, not just on the metal content. So that is a significant change because there were a lot of metal component values that were only 20% of the value. And so they were paying that 50% on a much smaller number. Now on the entire value creates a much greater financial impact on your landed cost. So this is both a upstream, procurement, obstacle and consideration, as well as downstream on what your selling price and how you're going to pass that on. So it's significant. And then there are changes. There's more than just this 25 to 50% variable. There are considerations if it is entirely of aluminum, steel, or copper, then you are still paying 50%, but on the full value, no derivative considerations. There are considerations for lower tariffs if, in fact, the steel component was obtained in the UK, for example, then you could have a lower rate of 15%. So there are a lot of variables to consider depending on, again, origin, value, but it's very important that you understand this is not something that, like we will talk about the pharmaceutical that's going to start in July. This started yesterday, right? So the impact already is here for goods that are entered in for consumption into the U.S. As of April 6th. So looking at the new harmonized classifications, looking at your value content to see if it meets a possible threshold, again, of less than 15% of the entire value could mean that you are exempt from the 232. There are certain harmonized classification numbers that were on the legacy derivatives list that are not on the new metals list that were introduced yesterday. So there's a lot to, again, go through, but it is, again, not industry specific simply because it is commodity specific. You've got to look at your harmonized numbers. You've got to check that new metals list. You've got to understand and defend not just the value content of the metals, but now you've got to really make sure you understand origin in totality and make sure that you have conversations with your broker that you're on the same page before those entries are filed. As it relates to the pharma, again, this, not that it is less important, because whenever you say 100% tariff, that is a headliner. So for pharmaceutical importers who are importing products into the United States, who were used to being on the legacy annex list of exemptions, now find themselves subject to starting with 100% tariff on, again, patented products. This has an exemption if it is generic pharmaceutical products. It is exempted from this tariff. if certain companies who have invested in onshoring or U.S. production have exemptions to this 100% tariff, first for the first 30 days. Then there are concessions that limit the additional tariffs to 50%, not the full 100%. So this is an evolving issue that has been introduced in a White House announcement. We are waiting the CSMS message for finality of the issue. However, it has a lot of companies, again, looking at the financial impact for an industry who has traditionally paid zero duties on finished pharmaceuticals, with an average duty per entry that is anywhere between 700,000 and $1.5 million per entry. This is a significant revenue now requirement that the government is going to be collecting in a time in which revenue is a very high priority for the U.S. government. So 232 has presidential authority. Look for more 232 examples as we go forward. I think that the overhaul of the metals and the pharma, again, will be followed by the semiconductor industry next.
Thanks, Rennie. That is helpful. Like you explained, that's a lot, right? So it can be very overwhelming. We encourage clients and importers, speak with your broker, consult with them, allow them to guide you through this. And we see this is more than just a tariff increase. It is a shift in strategy. And that actually brings us to another area where we're seeing the impact of a shift in strategy, which is shipments under DDP terms. So if we move to that, this is a big one we've been hearing from importers, specifically around shipping DDP. And we have been advising clients to proceed with caution. So with the increase in tariffs over the past year and added complexity around compliance, many importers have been led to believe that DDP is actually a simpler model, often encouraged by their suppliers. But we're now starting to see that perception shift. So what looks like reduced responsibility can actually mean reduced visibility and increased risk. So Rennie, can you connect this to the SAFE Act? What are regulators really targeting? What should importers be doing, especially if they are currently shipping under DDP terms?
Sure. So, Jency, again, excellent point raised. And we have to, in order to understand the magnitude of this topic, we have to never forget the responsibility of an importer and the legacy definitions of value. Now, with every action, there is a reaction, right? And with customs increase on enforcement as an action, to your point, the reaction was let's find a different means of operating that we could use as a platform for what? To lower the value being declared to customs, and the use of this concept of DDP or MDDP, as many people refer to it, this modified duty payment process, really called upon the restructuring of the importer of record being the supplier, using a lower value on the reporting to customs. Now, let's not forget, transaction value and the entered value that is required to be reported to customs has not changed. So to change the strategy of your procurement or acquisition process, there's nothing wrong with that. But once you amend the reporting process of value, that is the price paid or payable between a buyer and a seller. So rather than fall back on a platform that may not be a fit for all, is there a buyer? Is there a seller? And what is the price between that buyer and that seller? So if there is a factory sale price to a buyer, then that transaction value, again, is, if it meets the valuation threshold, is acceptable. But you can't say, I am the actual manufacturer of a product and I'm going to use the factory cost because I'm also going to be the importer of record, because it doesn't represent a transaction value. So there are 4 other methods of valuation that takes precedence. So customs, again, because enforcement is on the rise, national security, protection of revenue is on the rise, Customs is looking at these practices and saying, was this a arm's length transaction? Was this a true sale? And if so, what was the actual selling price? And does that price meet the threshold of what Customs considers to be a defendable value? And if not, there is already a trade facilitation and trade enforcement precedent for increased enforcement. There's already a trade fraud task force. There's already customs valuation, a rise in CF 28s and 29s investigations on value. So we are seeing these targets again materialize into more fines and penalties, and the targeting of not just foreign importers of record, but if it was a DDP platform and that foreign import of record was the importer in the entry, they are the culpable party. So again, the magnifying glass is out, and because there are a lot of companies who are not doing it in accordance with the valuation rules.
Thank you, Rennie. That's helpful. And so while moving away from DDP can feel like a big shift, and we've heard this from a lot of clients, whether it's moving away from DDP or just changing Incoterms in general, it feels like such a heavy lift for some importers. And we always recommend, work closely with your broker, your forwarder, fully understand both the cost and the compliance impact before making any changes. Rennie, do you have any other advice around that? How practically or tactfully like a importer can make those changes?
Yeah. So again, there is nothing wrong with changing your Incoterms. Managing your financial risk often includes amending your Incoterms. We've moved from a convenient type platform where there was a reliance on the seller as a convenience to do more in the transaction. However, let's just take a CIP term, for example, which includes the value components of the cost of the merchandise plus international freight charges, plus prepaid insurance premiums, all embedded in a particular price. Well, it is prudent of an importer to say, I don't want that bundled agreement anymore. I want to unbundle that process. I want to get down and remove some of those profit centers of the seller. Nothing wrong with that, just not at the expense of the transaction value for customs. So you make another excellent point. You have to speak with your broker. And if your broker is not well versed in the procurement decisions on pricing and value to that extent, then extend that conversation to your trade consultants or trade attorneys, right? But you need to, again, pursue options both to protect your financial risk while defending your trade compliance platform.
Great. Thank you, Rennie. So now let's move into what is brewing. So moving into the insider brew, these are the developments that are happening behind the scenes that may not always make the daily headlines, but they can have a real impact on importer strategy. So we're seeing continued uncertainty around USMCA renewal, an expansion of Section 301 investigations across key sectors, and growing legal challenges tied to Section 122. So Rennie, when I look at this list, what stands out to me is that trade policy, it's becoming more political and less predictable. So can you walk us through this? What are you seeing? Where's the most immediate risks for importers?
Well, all of them have risk on this bullet point list. I'll go through each of them to give you the example. But the convenience and the popularity that we have enjoyed with free trade agreements, namely the USMCA, right, is really up for grabs right now. It is uncertain on how this renewal will go through. It is very public. It is not a popular topic of discussion for the current administration. Um, they didn't like the NAFTA program when the first administration was in play, and which is why we changed to USMCA. And USMCA is not a popular platform because there is a belief that the United States is not benefiting as much as Canada and Mexico. So I believe that there are significant changes that will be part of the USMCA agreement. So for years, you know, involved with trade and free trade agreements, we always were used to possibly a delay in the ratification. And even when we changed from NAFTA to USMCA, many people said, it's basically the same thing, just change the name, right? But now I believe this will be the most significant change to USMCA. So for those importers who have a financial platform with a reliance that their goods come into the United States qualifying for USMCA from Canada and or Mexico, you could wake up to a very new reality that there is no longer that duty-free treatment, that eligibility criteria changes dramatically. I happen to believe that it was no mistake that the old NAFTA program, as one example, put forth a requirement that the producer had to create a certificate of origin, where USMCA said any member of the supply chain can create a certificate of origin. What increased the most as that change? Fines and penalties for the persons who submitted that declaration, right? So they expanded it and ended up collecting more. So I see that as kind of a glimpse to the future of USMCA. Whatever the agreement is, if it's ratified, will create an opportunity for more enforcement and against brokers, against importers, again, for not being able to defend a claim and making that claim at the time of import. So I see this as a significant revenue generator, not only in duties, fees, and taxes from Canada and Mexico, but a revenue generator for fines and penalties. The new Section 301 investigation, this is huge. If we talk about 301, most people will fill in the blank and say, you mean China 301? Because that's what we're used to hearing, the 301 investigation. Well, now you just manage and imagine that the 301 program is going to be the replacement for the current global tariffs of 10%. So instead of it just being China 301, the administration has now started an investigation to all countries using the same platform as the China 301 with justification to implement a replacement tariff to the global 122 tariff that, again, at its inception only had 150 days before it would expire. So the thought now and the plan that is public is that the 301 investigations will lead to a replacement tariff for the Section 122 global tariffs. So whether it stays at 10%, I don't believe it will, as the current economy, as the bill on the current Mideast war and conflict continues to rise at these alarming rates. Revenue collection is represented in the decisions that the administration is making. That's why we've got the new 232s, right? And you can expect that the China 301s will expand dramatically. You can expect that the Section 122 global tariffs will go through its lifetime, right? Though being challenged, do I think we're going to end up in a very similar scenario with the IEEPA CIT court challenge? We already have them, right? There are already states that have brought suit against 122 with a very good argument. So, yeah, we have tariffs is not a today conversation and not a tomorrow discussion. It is now embedded in the core considerations of our profiles. So all of this is an example of rising refund activity and compliance risk, right? the day in the life of an importer simply relying on a broker to clear a shipment and just let me know when it's released and how much duty I owe, those days are gone, right? An importer since 1993, we were reminded in the import community of something called importer reasonable care and due diligence, right? In the MOD Act. We were reminded of that again in 2016 under the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. We are reminded of that again because anytime you ask for a refund, we talked about the IEEPA refund, Customs is going through a very diligent effort to audit those entries. There's already a requirement that was established back in 1993 that importers have the responsibility to audit every entry that they file. Well, that is not a luxury. That is not a best practice. That's a regulation. And customs assumes before you ask for a refund that you have gone through a compliance affirmation that the information was true and correct before you dare to ask for any money back, right? So there is a rise not only because of refund, but a reminder of our existing responsibilities as importers, as trade professionals, to defend the declarations we've made, but more importantly, to defend anytime you want to ask for a refund. Because you know what a mistake is when you ask for a refund? That's called fraud. Customs says you are now threatening the financial platform of the U.S. government. And they believe you might have done that on purpose with an intent, again, to capture revenue that was undue you. So refunds, regular customs entry, the requirement, again, of due diligence is something that's very important that needs a lot of attention.
Thank you, Rennie. And that actually brings us to our strategy spotlight when it comes to IEEPA refunds, right?
Mhm.
We want to point out three things. At high level, it comes down to first, visibility, right? In terms of the IEEPA refunds, we want to make sure importers have access to their ACE data. Second, prepare. And third, validate, right? Validate that those entries and that data. So Rennie, can you walk us through this? Because we're hearing from many importers who feel stuck, whether it's because they don't have access to ACE, they're having trouble gaining access to ACE, or they're in ACE, they don't know what reports to pull, or they're just simply in a holding pattern waiting for Kate to roll out. So what are the key boxes that importers need to check to ensure that they've done everything they can at this point to prepare for refunds? We have about 3 minutes left. So if you can provide an explanation on that, that would be great.
Step one, every importer should be putting things in motion. The first thing you should be doing is making sure that you have ACE access, because ACE access is the only means in which you will be able to get a refund. Customs is not issuing hard copy checks. So you have to go in and join ACE. If you are a member of ACE, but you've lost your access due to password, inactivity, you have to contact that ACE help desk, off hours contact. That's step one. Then you register for the ACH e-refund process. Now, after getting involved with ACE, and during that time frame, you need to get access to what a report that is an importer activity report, referred to as an ES003. That activity report can either be obtained directly through your broker while you go through your ACE onboarding process, and it will give you access entry specific in a date range from February of 2025 all the way through February of 2026, February 24th. So in that particular process, you will identify IEEPA's paid, and then you'll have to segregate from the IEEPA's that was paid, what is the IEEPA that is due, because they are not a one-to-one match, which brings me to this internal audit. Customs in this CAPE, the consolidated administrative tool that they have rolled out, it is an audit tool. It is defined to identify an extract of duties from IEEPA. If you imported, I'll use an example of the EU, and the EU cap was 15%, and your rate of duty was 5% for your article. That means even though you paid 15% IEEPA, technically you are only due back 10% IEEPA refund. You've got to do that. You cannot claim 15% IEEPA. So how you extract that is conducting an audit. If you claim 15% IEEPA, Customs considers that fraud. Not only will they not pay you, you are subjecting yourselves to a penalty. So again, the diligence, gain access, e-refund registrations, but I implore you, the most important step forward, audit before you upload your information to this CAPE portal. Do not jump at the first opportunity when they say it's go live and here's my IEPA's paid, because that's not your true refund amount.
Thank you, Rennie. Well said. And we are up on time. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We do appreciate your time. As always, we will follow up on any questions. We hope to see you at our next Tariff Tea. We host these on the first Tuesday of every month. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.